James Razor Thompson, the feared strategist from Liverpool, and his ruthless second-in-command, Leon Bones Harris, built an empire of fear stretching from the city's backstreets to the quiet towns of North Wales. Teenage runners, coerced addicts, and innocent bystanders became pawns in their deadly game. This is the story of power, manipulation, and the takedown of one of the most dangerous county lines networks the UK has ever seen. Liverpool's history has long been tied to its docks, its music, and its fierce sense of identity. But beneath the surface, the same streets that shaped resilience also gave rise to opportunity for something darker. Out of tight-knit estates where unemployment was high and chances for young people were limited, an organized criminal group began to emerge. Their leaders were not the hardened old-school gangsters of the past, but younger figures who grew up watching the streets change. They were ambitious, ruthless, and understood that the drug trade was no longer just about supply within Liverpool. The new profit lay beyond, in the quiet towns and villages of North Wales, where competition was minimal and demand was quietly growing. The model was simple but effective. Drugs in Liverpool were cheap, and the network in the city was well established. The group realized that by transporting product just an hour away across the border, they could sell at double or even triple the price. Small Welsh towns lacked the infrastructure to resist them. Local dealers were no match for the violence, intimidation, and organization that the Liverpool group brought. With burner phones and dedicated lines, customers could order drugs like takeaway food. Runners would deliver at all hours, turning sleepy streets into busy markets hidden in plain sight. At first, the expansion went unnoticed. Police in North Wales saw only a gradual rise in low-level arrests and petty crime. Locals thought it was a temporary wave, but behind the scenes the OCG tightened its grip. Violence followed wherever they moved. Residents noticed unfamiliar cars parked late at night, groups of young men in tracksuits waiting by payphones, and addicts loitering outside supermarkets. What seemed like random changes were actually the early signs of a system being imposed, one that answered only to Liverpool. The speed of their rise was remarkable. In less than a year, the OCG established dominance in multiple towns. They didn't just sell drugs, they controlled entire supply chains. Local users were pushed into debt traps that forced them into servitude, while rivals were chased out, sometimes with brutal force. Fear spread quicker than the drugs themselves. People whispered about the new presence, but nobody dared speak openly. The group's reputation for violence meant silence was the safest choice. For the leaders, this expansion was more than business. It was about status. They weren't content with local dominance. They wanted recognition. Flashy cars, designer clothes, and expensive watches became the symbols of their success, flaunted in Liverpool while their runners labored in Wales. To outsiders, they appeared untouchable. To insiders, they were cold strategists, always looking for the next town to infiltrate, the next route to exploit. The empire was growing, and with each successful move, the confidence of the group hardened into arrogance. They believed they had found the perfect formula: cheap supply, high demand, and territories too quiet and unprepared to resist. What they didn't realize was that their very success was laying down a trail that would eventually draw attention, unravel their secrets, and set the stage for one of the most significant takedowns in the region's history. The leaders of the Liverpool group understood early that their empire could only grow if they had a steady supply of hands willing to do the work. They could not risk exposing themselves by traveling into small Welsh towns too often, so they looked for others who could be manipulated into carrying the drugs, storing cash, and answering phones. Their eyes turned to the young and the vulnerable, people whose desperation or naivety could be twisted into obedience. Teenagers from broken homes, school dropouts, and children who longed for belonging were the perfect recruits. The gang's approach was calculated. They offered what seemed like friendship and opportunity. A new pair of trainers, a little cash in hand, or a ride in a flashy car was enough to impress boys who had never known luxury. For some, Even the promise of being part of something bigger was more valuable than the money itself. Slowly they were pulled into a world they thought was glamorous, but in reality it was a trap designed to keep them dependent. Once recruited, the demands began. The boys were given burner phones and train tickets to North Wales, told to carry bags filled with small wraps hidden in clothing or food packaging. The instructions were clear: never question, never talk, never lose the product. Failure was not an option. At first, the thrill of traveling and holding cash felt empowering, but the reality soon revealed itself. Every train ride carried the risk of arrest. Every street corner held the threat of rival violence, and every call on the drug line was another reminder that they were just pawns in a dangerous game. The system was designed to trap them permanently. If a package went missing or money came up short, a debt was created. That debt never disappeared, it only grew. The teenagers were told they had to work harder, deliver more, and sell faster to pay it back. Fear was used as a weapon. They were reminded of what could happen if they tried to walk away: beatings, threats to families, and stories of others who had vanished. By then the dream of quick money had turned into chains that bound them to the gang. The exploitation didn't stop at the young runners. Vulnerable adults, particularly addicts, were targeted too. Known as cuckooing, the gang would take over the homes of struggling users, forcing them to host dealers and stash drugs in exchange for small amounts of supply. Entire flats became bases of operation, invisible to outsiders but central to the network. These people had no real choice. Resistance was met with violence, and cooperation was rewarded only with enough drugs to keep them hooked. As the weeks passed, the network of controlled young runners and broken adults expanded. For the OCG leaders, it was a perfect system. They remained distant and insulated, while those at the bottom absorbed all the risks. For the communities in North Wales, the signs were subtle but unmistakable. Unfamiliar teenagers lingering on street corners, houses once quiet, now busy at all hours, and local children suddenly wearing expensive clothes they could never have afforded. Beneath the surface, exploitation was taking root, and the OCG's power was spreading through fear, manipulation, and the silent suffering of those too young and too weak to fight back. In the towns and villages of North Wales, life had always moved at a slower pace. Families knew one another, shops closed early, and the streets emptied at night. But as the Liverpool group expanded, the atmosphere began to shift in ways that residents could feel but struggled to explain. It started with small changes: graffiti tags appearing on walls, groups of unfamiliar faces hanging around bus stops, and late-night traffic in neighborhoods that were once quiet. What seemed minor at first soon became impossible to ignore. Crime statistics began to climb. Shoplifting, petty theft, and burglaries rose in places that had rarely experienced them. Addicts desperate for money turned to stealing, and with every new arrest came whispers of where the drugs were coming from. Police officers on the ground noticed the patterns but struggled to keep up. These towns had limited resources, and their forces were unprepared for an organized system controlled from outside their borders. The OCG had chosen their territory carefully, knowing that smaller communities lacked the manpower to fight back effectively. For ordinary residents, fear crept in slowly. People noticed dealers standing openly in car parks, waiting for calls on burner phones. They saw the same strangers day after day, but nobody dared confront them. Small businesses felt the pressure as addicts loitered outside, scaring away customers. Parents warned their children not to hang around certain areas, and elderly residents locked their doors earlier than ever before. The once friendly streets felt different, unwelcoming, tense, and heavy with an unseen presence. The OCG's tactics were ruthless. Addicts who fell into debt were treated as tools rather than customers. They were forced to run errands, store drugs, or act as decoys to distract the police. Violence was never far away. Stories spread of people being beaten in alleyways, of rivals suddenly disappearing, and of threats made to families who spoke out. Even if these stories were exaggerated, their effect was real: silence. The fear of reprisal ensured that almost no one was willing to contact the authorities. The gang's control extended beyond drugs, it reached into the daily behavior of entire communities. For those caught in the middle, life became unbearable. Teachers saw children arriving at school exhausted, carrying expensive items they could not explain. Social workers reported a rise in neglected homes where parents were consumed by addiction. The fabric of small-town life was unraveling under the weight of an operation that most residents barely understood. To many, it felt like a shadow had settled over their towns, visible in every corner, yet impossible to grasp. Behind it all, the leaders in Liverpool grew bolder. They monitored profits and demanded more from their runners, pushing the operation further into the heart of North Wales. What they underestimated, however, was the ripple effect their presence was causing. Each crime, each frightened resident, and each broken life was another piece of evidence slowly gathering against them. The silence of the towns may have shielded the OCG in the short term, but the growing unease was planting seeds that would one day lead to their downfall. Power within the Liverpool group brought with it both wealth and paranoia. As their grip tightened over towns in North Wales, the leaders began to see threats everywhere. Rivals, associates, even friends. They believed their empire could collapse at any sign of weakness. So they ruled with fear, ensuring that no one dared to step out of line. Violence became their tool of choice, not only for controlling the streets, but also for controlling their own people. Discipline within the network was brutal. Runners who lost money or misplaced product were subjected to public humiliation and beatings. The punishment was deliberate, designed not just to hurt but to send a message. Anyone watching would understand that mistakes carried consequences far beyond the loss itself. Those who questioned orders or showed hesitation were treated as liabilities. Some were forced out, while others simply disappeared, their absence left unexplained. The fear of becoming the next example kept most in line, even as the workload and risks grew heavier. The violence extended beyond the gang's ranks. Rival dealers who attempted to resist were quickly crushed. Houses were vandalized, cars were set alight, and attacks took place in broad daylight. The message to the local underworld was clear: the Liverpool group had no tolerance for competition. In a short span of time they had established near-total dominance, not just through supply, but through intimidation that made challenging them unthinkable. The paranoia of the leaders also reached into their personal lives. They trusted no one fully, not even their closest associates. Money was hidden in safe houses, weapons were stashed in multiple locations, and meetings were moved constantly to avoid detection. They demanded loyalty, but offered little in return, creating an environment where fear was the only glue holding the network together. Associates who had once been eager to prove themselves began to realize that their positions were precarious. One wrong move could end everything. In the communities under their control, the gang's reputation grew darker with each incident. Residents whispered about the violence, piecing together fragments of stories about people who had been attacked or driven out. Though few had witnessed the events directly, the impact was unmistakable. The OCG thrived on this atmosphere. By keeping people afraid, they ensured silence. Fear became as powerful as any weapon, allowing them to operate with minimal resistance. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The constant pressure on runners, the unpredictability of punishments, and the ever-present threat of violence created instability within the ranks. Some began to think about escape, while others quietly resented the leaders who grew rich off their suffering. The empire was still expanding, but it was built on fragile foundations. For the leaders, the displays of violence were proof of their strength. To them it was control. Yet in reality, each act of brutality left behind witnesses, rumors and scars that would eventually attract unwanted attention. What they saw as power was, in truth, evidence that one day would be used against them, turning their carefully built system of fear into the very reason for their downfall. For months, the Liverpool group operated as though invisible. Convinced their system was flawless, they had expanded without serious resistance, and their network of runners seemed reliable. But empires often fall not from external pressure, but from small, careless mistakes. That first crack appeared on an ordinary evening at a railway station. A young runner, barely 16, was stopped by officers conducting what should have been a routine search. The boy was nervous, his bag heavy, his story unconvincing. Inside the lining of his tracksuit were dozens of small wraps of heroin and crack cocaine, bundled together with elastic bands. Alongside them was a wad of cash and a phone that would prove far more valuable than the drugs themselves. To the officers, the arrest seemed like another low-level dealer caught in the cycle of addiction and crime. But as they examined the phone, something unusual emerged. The device wasn't filled with personal photos or contacts, but with hundreds of names and coded messages. Numbers appeared linked to locations across multiple towns in North Wales. Orders were logged with times, quantities and references that pointed to a wider operation. The boy himself had little to say, terrified of the consequences if he spoke. Yet the data on his phone spoke volumes. What had looked like a small arrest began to resemble the edge of something far larger. Detectives tracing the messages noticed patterns almost immediately. The same numbers appeared again and again, linked to different towns but operated from a central point. The so-called line was active at all hours, sending out instructions to runners and receiving orders from customers. The scale of coordination was far beyond what a single teenager could manage. This wasn't an isolated dealer, it was a network. The discovery shifted the focus from local crime to organized activity, drawing the attention of specialist units trained to handle such cases. As the investigation deepened, further connections appeared. The numbers linked back to Liverpool, specifically to areas already known for gang activity. Surveillance images from ticket offices confirmed that multiple young runners had been traveling the same routes, often carrying nothing but small backpacks and burner phones. Police began piecing together timetables, matching arrests in different towns to the same supply chain. Every detail tightened the picture, building a map of movement that stretched far beyond one boy's arrest. For the Liverpool leaders, the incident barely registered. Runners were expected to get stopped occasionally. It was a cost of doing business. They replaced the boy within days, confident that nothing would trace back to them. What they didn't realize was that their carelessness had given investigators the first real thread to pull. Each number on that phone, each message, and each address listed, was a breadcrumb leading directly toward their hidden empire. What seemed like a routine arrest had quietly shifted the balance. For the first time, the gang was no longer invisible. They had left a digital footprint too large to ignore, and investigators now had proof that this was not random street dealing, but a coordinated county lines network. The leaders still felt untouchable, still paraded their wealth in Liverpool, but the ground beneath them had begun to move. The mistake was small, but it was enough to set in motion a chain of events that would slowly unravel everything they had built. Once investigators identified the network through that first careless arrest, they knew patience was their greatest weapon. They could not rush. The Liverpool OCG was careful, paranoid, and well-connected. Every step had to be calculated. Surveillance teams were deployed across Liverpool and North Wales, blending into the background while tracking the movement of runners, vehicles, and messages. Unmarked cars followed suspects for hours, sometimes days, without making contact. Every purchase, drop-off, and meeting was noted and logged. The gang, confident in their secrecy, had no idea they were being watched so closely. Phones, the very tools the gang relied on to coordinate deliveries, became the investigators' most valuable asset. Analysts decoded texts, tracked numbers, and connected multiple devices to a single hub. They watched as the leaders communicated in code, seemingly random phrases that masked exact instructions. Yet, patterns emerged. Certain words indicated the type of drug, the quantity, or the town of delivery. Using these patterns, police began mapping the supply chain, identifying safe houses, and even predicting when a shipment would move. The network that once seemed untouchable was slowly being understood, piece by piece. Meanwhile, officers on the ground in North Wales continued their covert observation. They monitored flats taken over by the gang, noting who entered and exited, when deliveries were made, and how the local population interacted with the runners. Residents who had once been too afraid to speak now became inadvertent witnesses, their routine observations helping to fill gaps in the surveillance puzzle. Each small detail, a familiar face at a bus stop, a bag left behind, a new car arriving late at night, added layers to the investigators' understanding of the operation. The gang's confidence began to betray them. They noticed the occasional stranger in their midst, the rare camera flash on a bus platform, and the subtle tailing of their vehicles. In response, they became more cautious, changing routes and swapping phones more frequently. But these adjustments only confirmed to the investigators that they were close. Every new measure taken by the gang was analyzed, every deviation from routine catalogued. The OCG's own paranoia became a roadmap, highlighting the very locations and individuals that needed the closest attention. What made the surveillance so effective was its patience. Weeks turned into months, yet investigators did not rush. They allowed the leaders to continue their daily routines, collecting data, photographs, and recording. Safe houses were monitored silently, meetings observed from a distance, and vehicles tracked meticulously. Each piece of evidence was catalogued, ensuring that when the time came to strike, it would be impossible for the gang to claim ignorance or mistake. By the time the authorities were ready to move in, they had constructed a complete picture of the network. They knew who was in charge, who managed each line, the exact routes used to transport drugs, and even the schedules of the runners. The Liverpool OCG, once untouchable and confident, had unknowingly exposed themselves at every level. The walls of secrecy that had protected them were now penetrated by the patient, methodical work of law enforcement. The stage was set for a coordinated action that would bring months of observation and planning to a dramatic and final conclusion. The morning of the takedown arrived with precision and coordination that mirrored the meticulous planning months earlier. As dawn broke over Liverpool and North Wales, teams of armed officers and specialized units moved into position. Unmarked vans lined the streets near safe houses, helicopters hovered quietly above, and surveillance teams prepared to relay real-time information. Every detail had been rehearsed, every scenario anticipated, and yet the tension was palpable. One misstep could compromise the entire operation, allowing the OCG to vanish into the maze of streets they knew so well. Across the region, simultaneous raids began. Doors were breached with battering rams, alarms blared, and the sudden presence of law enforcement shattered the early morning quiet. Officers moved quickly and decisively, ensuring that the leaders could not escape. Inside the houses, cash was seized, drugs were confiscated, and weapons were secured. The chaos was total, yet controlled. Young runners, many of whom had never experienced such force, froze in disbelief as their daily routines and carefully cultivated fear evaporated in a matter of minutes. In Liverpool, the leaders of the OCG were confronted with the reality they had avoided for so long. Their cars were blocked, exits sealed, and safe houses surrounded. The pride and arrogance that had allowed them to operate for years now worked against them. They were powerless, caught in a trap they could neither charm nor intimidate their way out of. Officers moved with authority, and even the most defiant members of the gang were compelled to comply. North Wales, too, saw the same overwhelming show of force. Flats that had been silent hubs of activity now echoed with the sound of law enforcement commands. Runners who had been sent out on deliveries were intercepted mid-route, their phones and bags seized as evidence. The local population, long living in fear, watched from behind curtains as the gang that had dominated their streets for months was brought to its knees. For the first time, the threat that had loomed over them felt tangible and final. Every arrest was documented meticulously. Investigators ensured that evidence linking each member to the broader network was captured, leaving no room for legal loopholes. Cash was counted, drugs were catalogued, and communication devices were analyzed on site. The operation was not just about arresting individuals, it was about dismantling the empire entirely. Each confiscated item, each seized message, was another brick pulled from the foundation that had held the OCG together. By mid-morning, the scale of the takedown was clear. Dozens of individuals, from high-ranking leaders to low-level runners, were in custody. Safe houses were emptied, vehicles impounded, and the supply chain disrupted. The streets, once dominated by fear and violence, began to breathe again. Residents emerged cautiously, witnessing a world they had long feared and seeing it transformed in hours. The operation was a culmination of patience, intelligence, and precise execution. What had once seemed untouchable had been rendered powerless. The empire that had stretched from Liverpool to North Wales, feeding off fear and control, was dismantled almost overnight. The leaders, now behind bars, would face the consequences of their actions, while the communities they had terrorized could begin the slow process of reclaiming their streets and their sense of security. The aftermath of the takedown reverberated across Liverpool and North Wales, leaving communities both relieved and shaken. For months, residents had lived under the shadow of the OCG, adjusting their routines to avoid confrontation, silently observing the comings and goings of strangers, and internalizing a fear that seemed to have no end. Now, with the leaders behind bars and the runners arrested, a cautious sense of freedom returned. Streets that had once been dominated by loitering gangs and tense silences slowly began to feel familiar again. Shopkeepers reopened without fear of being pressured by local dealers. Parents allowed their children outside once more, and the late-night quiet began to settle over neighborhoods that had long forgotten it. Yet, even as relief spread, the scars of the empire remained visible. Families of runners struggled to understand how their children had become enmeshed in such a dangerous system. Many young recruits faced the challenge of reintegration, carrying the psychological weight of fear, intimidation, and exposure to criminal behavior. Some had endured violence firsthand, while others had been coerced into acts they barely comprehended at the time. The trauma was pervasive, reaching far beyond the individuals arrested and touching everyone who had lived in the towns influenced by the gang. The trial of the leaders became a spectacle that drew attention from both local media and national outlets. Evidence collected during the surveillance and raids revealed the staggering organization and scale of the operation. Phones, bank accounts, and hidden stashes of cash and drugs demonstrated not just their reach, but their meticulous planning. Victims and witnesses testified, recounting stories of exploitation, coercion, and fear. Their accounts painted a picture of a network that had thrived on the vulnerabilities of others, manipulating and controlling people with precision and cruelty. The courtroom became a stage where the full weight of the OCG's crimes was laid bare, confirming to the public the extent of the terror that had quietly gripped their towns. Even after the convictions, whispers of the gang's lingering influence persisted. Some suggested that loyalty and connections remained, despite incarceration, hinting at an underground network capable of regaining power once the leaders were released. For authorities, these fears underscored the importance of continued vigilance and community support to prevent a resurgence. The dismantling of the empire was a victory, but it was not a cure-all. It was a first step in reclaiming control from an organization that had thrived in secrecy and fear. For the communities, the experience became a lesson in resilience and awareness. Neighbors who had been silent witnesses were now more likely to report suspicious behavior. Schools, social services, and local councils increased outreach, aiming to prevent the recruitment of vulnerable youth into similar operations. The streets began to regain life, but the memory of what had occurred lingered as a reminder of how quickly fear and control can spread in small towns. The story of the Liverpool OCG, once untouchable and feared, ended in defeat, yet its shadow remained. It became a cautionary tale of power, manipulation, and the consequences of operating outside the law. While justice had been served, the emotional and social impact endured, highlighting the long road toward healing, vigilance, and the reclamation of communities once gripped by fear. The empire had fallen, but its story would echo for years as both warning and testament to the power of persistence, intelligence, and courage in the face of organized crime.